Okay, welcome to part 3. This is Romanticism part 3, and we're going to finish out Romanticism talking about Romanticism in France. And as we were mentioning, we're talking about Romanticism in Germany and Germans who were living in Italy and in England, but there was also Romantic tendencies going on in France. Romanticism kind of came late to France, and probably no painter symbolizes French Romanticism better than Delacroix. We've already looked at this painting a number of times, Liberty Leading the People. Um, but all of Delacroix's whole career really kind of represents sort of a romantic spirit, in that he was quite a free thinker, quite an individualist. And in his work, we see a lot of the same kind of obsession with romantic subject matter that we see some other romantic artists, but we also see, like Turner, an interest in the way he paints to be emblematic of that romantic spirit, right? That like as much as communicated by how he approaches a painting, such as what he chooses to paint. So he is much more painting more gesturally than a lot of his contemporaries. You can see to a certain degree some influence from uh, Baroque painters like Tiepolo, but also he's much more interested in ambient color, like Turner. He was interested in color being expressive rather than being simply kind of a naming of the local color of each object. And And I also would like to just emphasize that um, Delacroix was just an amazing painter, really a very, very competent painter. And you can see that from a painting like this portrait he did here. And he did do many commissioned portraits. I think sometimes I get the feeling that his heart was in more works like this portrait, um, that portrait of a girl at a cemetery, where her as a subject is more a kind of a romantic subject rather than this commissioned portrait. But he was, yeah, truly a great painter. And at the same time, the other great painter of this age was Jean was a um, was Ingres. And Jean Auguste Dominique Ingres was also a really great painter. It was kind of an age dominated by these two great giants. We've seen Ingres before. We've talked about this drawing, this portrait of Paganini, a number of times. And Ingres, one of the things I want to talk about here is Ingres and Neoclassicism. And Ingres' Neoclassicism, Ingres studied with David, and his paintings definitely show a David kind of a bias and approach towards painting and a continuation of that neoclassical tradition. And in some ways, you could see Ingres as being a neoclassical precursor um, to Romanticism, and you can also see him as a kind of a counter revolutionary force, a counter force to the romantic excesses of Delacroix and Gross and of even of Géricault. But um, the other thing about Ang and about that form of neoclassicism is that it was not exempt from the influences of Romanticism, as we shall see. There was definitely a romantic flavor to the whole period, and it affected decisions that were made by Ang just as much as it by any of the other artists. We can see that in this set, especially this one here on the left. Um, this painting is a painting, kind of an imagined scene, imagining Raphael with his mistress as he's working on a painting of her. And and this painting very much fits into the tradition of what the French called the Style Troubadour, which was a particular style of historical paintings where it was focused on medieval and Renaissance themes and costumes and settings, and painted in kind of a somewhat stiff and Renaissance kind of style. but a neoclassical kind of style. And it is definitely is as much a part of the Romantic age as the works of Delacroix, because it's just reflecting a different kind of approach to Romanticism, and maybe a much more tight and controlled approach, but um, but still, focusing on romantic themes and romantic subject matter. And in that light, I think looking at a painting like this, Le Grand Odalisque, kind of changes our view. Instead of just thinking of it just as an example of neoclassicism, we can also see it as an example of the romantic um, spirit of the age, right? That um, not only because of the kind of exotic subject matter, but also the the kind of the elaborate stretching of her anatomy in almost a mannerist kind of way uh, is also kind of an expression of that um, Baroque spirit. And um, I think even on this page, especially looking at this painting by Jupiter, or by Ang, the Jupiter and Thetis, if you look at the way her body's kind of stretched and her neck is turned, how kind of exaggerated and artificial that is. Um, and that also kind of shows that similar kind of artificial style in some of the works of Ang and of his contemporary neoclassicists that shows a kind of a romantic spirit. Lastly, among the French painters, I want to talk about Géricault, although he died young and therefore did not have such a long influence as Delacroix did. The reason why I want to talk about him last is because in his work we see both um, that romantic approach, but we also see the beginnings of the end of Romanticism, in that we see hints of the realist approach to painting, that in a way this painting foretells what we're going to see with Courbet in just 30 years. And towards the end of his life, not that he knew it was the end of his life, but because he died young, um, but in 1822, he painted a series of 10 portraits. He visited an insane asylum. Apparently, a friend of his was a psychiatrist there. And so he painted these 10, apparently, only 5 of them exist today. So there were 10 portraits um, of patients there. Each one had a different form of psychosis. And I think these paintings are fascinating and interesting for a number of reasons. One, just because they're remarkably good painting, and two, because of the compassion and intensity of looking that he brings to the subjects. But also, I think the paintings are really fascinating because it shows this kind of almost a modernist way of thinking, in that he's doing these paintings like scientific observation, or even an experiment in of itself, um, to figure out, feeling like somehow if he could really examine these people, he would know something deeper. uh, Jericho himself, his family suffered from uh, psychological maladies, and he was not always the happiest of persons. So probably was looking to these to find some information about himself. And so that kind of takes us to the end of Romanticism, but I don't want to end there. I want to just um, my last coda, which is to talk about going back to England and talk about the Pre-Raphaelites. We've been hinting about the Pre-Raphaelites all the way through this lecture, talking about different groups of artists who were influences on the Pre-Raphaelites. And there's a reason for that, because the Pre-Raphaelites in some way are this kind of movement that most embodies the Pre-Raphael, or the Romantic spirit. They're the reason why they were called Pre-Raphaelites, it was a small group of artists who called themselves the Brotherhood of Pre-Raphaelites. That group expanded in influence later, but at first it was just about 5 artists, really. working. And their goal, the reason why they called themselves Pre-Raphaelites, was because they were trying in a way to go back to a period before Raphael, before the High Renaissance. Not that it wasn't that they were critical of Raphael or of the High Renaissance in general. It was that they were critical of how much culture since then had stopped looking and had just become about mimicking the past. And so they wanted to put themselves back in the shoes of Giotto and Della Francesco and try to recreate looking and seeing and thinking about painting for themselves. And in a way, you can tell that it's a very similar goal as what the Nazarenes were after, and that was very influential on these on the Pre-Raphaelites. And so I think this painting here, um, Jesus in the carpenter's house, is probably very emblematic of those uh, early goals of the movement, to really try to go back to and find a new way of painting. Whereas, like this painting by Rossetti, this is a Malay right here. This painting by Rossetti and this painting by Edward Burne-Jones are much more show kind of where the movement ended up in a more stylized way. Um, and then lastly, I want to end on this painting because I feel like this painting by Malay, Ophelia, um, is as good a summing up of the Romantic movement as any painting, really. Almost as good as some of the great paintings by Friedrich in terms of really capturing the Romantic period and the Romantic mood. Um, and it is quite a striking, amazing painting. All right. Thank you. I will see you guys on Monday.